Welcome to the AAUC monthly podcast series on building our collective American dream. I'm Jack Hanna, board member of the Asian American Unity Coalition, also known as AAUC, and I'm pleased you have joined us today. In this episode, our host, fellow board member Rajeev Singh, conducted a fascinating interview with Norman Chen, the new Chief Executive Officer of the Asian American Trust. TAAF has quickly emerged as a very successful leader of the Asian community by securing $1.1 billion for AAPI funding. Let's join Rajeev and Norman Chen and hear his unique story of Asian American self-identity and the goals and aspirations he and TAAF have for the future.
Norman, thank you for taking time to talk to us today, especially in these times where we need to have more and more of this conversation. But before I get started, I wanted to get a little bit of a history and story, which is how did you end up in this world of Asian American advocacy?
Thanks, Rajeev. I'm born in the Midwest in Minnesota to immigrant parents who are studying as graduate students here. They're part of that wave that came in the late 50s and early 60s to the US. And then I grew up mostly in the East Coast, in the Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania area, and a couple years in California for graduate school. Then I moved to Asia for 20 years. For the first time in my life, I had a chance to live as a member of the majority. But that's a very impactful experience where your culture is celebrated and where there are no glass ceilings for people of your ethnicity and race. So coming back to the US 10 years ago, for our kids to go to school in the US, I had a little bit of a different attitude. I really felt empowered and felt that racial equality was a critical purpose and goal for my life, but especially in the last 2 years with all the terrible events against Asian Americans and the anti-Asian American sentiment in certain parts of the country. We really felt like we had to do something and give back to our community. So we formed a small nonprofit organization called Launch, Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change, to see what we can do. As Asian Americans, we thought, what can we do to try to get at the core of the Asian American attacks and sentiment in the US? And so doing some research, we found that hate crimes often start with a feeling of one group seeing another group as a threat, as competition. There's research by Professor Susan Fisk at Princeton, which basically looks at people in two dimensions, how friendly they are and how competent they are. The groups that are seen as the biggest threat are those that are unfriendly and are seen as competent. And unfortunately, Asian Americans are seen in that bucket. Stereotypes and perceptions are very important. They're the precursors to scapegoating, which then can lead to violence during times of crisis. So we wanted to find out what research exists about stereotypes of Asian Americans. And surprisingly, the last major study was done 20 years ago. That's long overdue. Our population has nearly doubled since then. So we created the status index to look at perceptions and attitudes of Americans overall towards Asian Americans. I'll just cite 3 statistics from that study. Number 1 is we asked people to use 3 adjectives to describe Asian Americans. And the 3 adjectives that came back were no surprise, perfectly following the model minority myth. Nice and kind, hardworking, and intelligent. That hasn't changed for 50 years. So we're still seen in a very one-dimensional way. The second question we asked is agree or disagree. Do you think Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin or more loyal to the US? And although 80% of Americans felt yes, we're more loyal to the US, there still was a group of 20% that said they felt Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin. So hence really questioning our patriotism, our loyalty here, and fostering xenophobia. The third question was perhaps the one that got the most publicity, which was, can you name a prominent Asian American? And unfortunately, 42% of our respondents couldn't, off the top of their head, name a prominent Asian American. So it shows, again, nothing right or wrong, but just where we are in the minds of Americans overall. And frankly, we're largely invisible. So we got involved with Launch. That created us some national awareness. And as a result of that and some prior relationships, I was invited to then become the new CEO of TAAF. I've been here for about a month.
Now, if I may ask, here you felt different, even though you lived in Midwest and East Coast. Then you went to China, and then you come back to the United States. How did your perception of the challenges of Asian Americans change over those 3 distinct phases of your journey?
Growing up, I used to, like many kids, and you'll hear this many, many times, Rajeev, just wanted to be like everybody else, right? In America, you don't want to stick out. I used to ask myself, why did I end up being the kid who turned out to be Asian American? Why didn't I just end up to be the kid who was white American? I'm sure kids who had other differences, perhaps disabilities or handicaps, may have asked themselves those same questions. Coming to Asia as an adult and spending 20 years in Asia, and I lived in Hong Kong and I traveled the region. So I really had a Pan-Asian experience. It's just so empowering, as you know, to be in an environment where your skin color is not seen as a handicap and you see so many role models and leaders who look similar to you. It's very empowering. So definitely I gained more of an understanding of my culture, definitely more pride in my culture. It changed my perception of being an Asian American because I really felt like now being Asian American is a huge strength and being bicultural is a huge strength. It's a healthy perspective that many people who have an international background bring when they come to the US, which I think is fantastic, and that self-pride that they have in their identity. Now that I'm back in the US and it's been 10 plus years, I think clearly the anti-Asian American sentiment has been a shocking and unfortunate reality, but it has really prompted me to learn more about our history. And those who understand Asian American history know that this is just a repetition of multiple cycles of anti-Asian American sentiment that have occurred. So these underlying issues haven't never been addressed, right? About us being perceived as others, as threats, and these stereotypes and misperceptions. Because of my time in Asia, I now come at this whole area with greater sense of purpose and a better vision for what our society can be, having seen something like this in Asia. It really inspires me. I'm confident that Asian Americans will increase in terms of pride, visibility, acceptance, impact, power in the US. It's a demographic reality, and as our political and economic power increases, it will be more impactful.
You mentioned that in a survey, 20% of respondents alluded to the fact that country of origin drives more loyalty. People
Yes.
perceive that 20% of the immigrants still feel loyal to their countries of origin.
Let me just state the statistic, which is that we ask people agree or disagree that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin. And of the 3,000 people in the survey, roughly 20% felt that Asian Americans are more loyal to their country of origin.
How do we change the perception that it is okay? How do we, at the policy level, not let this impact the perception about Asian Americans?
This is a classic question. As I have grown up and appreciated more about both American culture and Asian culture, there are 30, 40, 50 ethnicities among the Asian American community, and they have such differences, and some of them have been enemies for hundreds of years. How do you bring everybody together? I would say I have so many friends who have different backgrounds, and I love the richness of their cultures and that diversity. We should celebrate each of our own respective cultures and backgrounds. In China, there are many. In India, there are many alone. And so we celebrate that, but then we work together to also share those cultures and share political power, economic power. So we use solidarity to increase our ability to make a difference in the US to help our community. So to me, it's not zero sum, it's additive, it's exponential how we can work together in trying to improve our lives and the lives of our communities. And I also say the other trend, which is again very positive demographically, look at generations. My parents, as Chinese American immigrants, still largely socialize with Chinese American. They have their get-togethers, and that's similar for other people in that generation. My generation, we tend to mix and mingle more. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and we have that advantage demographically. And so I'm very optimistic about this in the future as well, Rajeev.
Mm-hmm. How can we address this new development of the politics of our countries of origin being brought into question, and then that leading to questioning our loyalty to this country?
This question of the perpetual foreigner mentality. Our feeling is that America has always been a country of immigrants. It's made stronger by this diversity of ethnic groups, languages, religions, cultures coming together and finding commonality in the pursuit of equality and opportunity. We know that immigrants today continue to face the same challenges that have existed for generations. This othering concept that I mentioned earlier, discrimination and terrible hate crimes and incidents. We want to do at TAAF is really to be a convener, an incubator, and a funder to expand efforts to address these longstanding challenges so we can really make some impactful changes. So we're working on education so that people can better understand the stories of AAPI immigrants and their families, whether they've been in the US for generations or are recent immigrants. We've provided a grant to the Asian American Education Project, which works with UCLA and Stanford to provide curriculum and educational materials K through 12 for school districts to teach AAPI history as a core part of American history classes. And then recently, you may have heard about the introduction of Sesame Street's first ever Korean American character, Ji Young. young. That was a huge step forward because it demonstrates to young Asian American kids, especially those who are new to our country, that our communities are a valued part of American culture. So yes, there's history from Asia, but again, we're focusing on addressing the hate here in the US through education and several other initiatives.
A somewhat related idea to this othering is this concept of our political affiliations. It is no secret that by and large, the Asian American community has leaned on one side of the spectrum, but lately we are starting to see us split up. How does TAAF plan to serve its benefactors across such political differences?
TAAF is focused, as I mentioned, on a number of really key truths about our communities that really transcend political differences, how we're bringing together ethnic groups from around the world that have been historically at odds with each other. And if we can do that between the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans, for example, we should be able to bring together people of different political bents to really further the Asian American community. The realities that we are dealing with are that our communities are severely underfunded and under-resourced. And we are currently under attack due to the anti-AAPI hate and violence. We are underrepresented in seats of power across industries and government, and we are the most economically divided racial group in America today. These are the big systemic problems that TAAF wants to address in partnership with advocates, no matter what their partisan leaning is. We are a nonpartisan organization. We don't get distracted or hung up by the politics of the day because we have real work that needs to be done to better support and protect the AAPI communities, especially again, as hate and violence are surging at such alarming rates. We are focused on the collective goals and really are nonpartisan in our efforts to do that.
Speaking of collective goals and hate and violence, what we are noticing is a continually shrinking space for dialogue and constructive engagement. And it almost appears like there is no tolerance left for expressing a difference of opinion. How do we address that?
One real value added we are seeing and need in our community is to have greater dialogue and greater convening. There are 1,000 AAPI nonprofit organizations out there, Rajeev, as you may know. And in our study with the Urban Institute, half of them have annual budgets of less than $1 million. So under-resourced, run by very passionate, capable people, but oftentimes working in specific silos or areas and not having enough opportunity or resources to dialogue. An important role that we play is to be a convener. And we're looking at multiple opportunities in 2022 to bring together leaders across ethnic groups, across silos, across geographies to talk and share best practices. We have funded 3 action centers to address the hate in Oakland, Chicago, New York. And these are part of our national network to address hate and violence against Asian Americans. And so we're working with each of those locations who have very strong local relationships, who then will develop best practices to respond to hate, to work with victims and their families. And then we will share those best practices across our national network. We're working with the Sikh Coalition, we're working with Interfaith Youth Coalition, we're working with Asian Health Services in Oakland, Chinese American Service League in Chicago, and then the Asian American Federation in New York City. A wonderful network, including others, to really share ideas, develop best practices, and convene. And we want to do this in data. We want to do this in other areas as well to really bring together these groups that have been too separate for too long.
You used 3 words earlier. You said convener, funder, and incubator. Shine a little bit more light as to what that translates to.
I think this is something we really want to share with the community and help them understand what we see as our role. It's multiple levels in terms of our role. Certainly, we talked about the convening role is really important to bring together different groups to share ideas. There's been just not enough of that in the past because of the lack of resources. I think people just tend to stay focused and don't realize what else is going on by other strong groups. So there's a role for us to bring groups together on a national scale on a regular basis, and also to convene different types of organizations. What makes TAAF really quite unique is our ability to bring together not only the nonprofit world and the government world, Rajeev, but also the media cultural world, and also very important to fund all this, the business and corporate world. That's been a piece that's been lacking at scale in the past. We're at the nexus of these 4 groups, and that's what allows us to make a significant difference going forward. So that's the convener piece. The funder piece is where we have raised $1.1 billion. Of that $1.1 billion, that is with our partners in the business business community, of that 1.1 billion, frankly, most of that is under the control of our corporate partners and our business partners. Roughly about 900 million is actually amounts committed by our corporate partners, which they are dedicated to supporting the AAPI community, and they are the ones who are allocating, but they are announcing those commitments with us as part of our campaign. And then we have under our own mandate 150 or so million dollars over 5 years for our operations. So we are a source of funding, but frankly, the larger source of funding are our corporate partners, are the federal government, and other partners that really want to connect to organizations that need the funding. So we are a funder and also a connector of funding to organizations as well. And that's an important role that we play because our community has been largely under-resourced for so long. We do not, however, control $1.1 billion ourselves. And sometimes people have that misunderstanding. The third piece is if we find organizations that are doing great work, we will direct funding towards them, either our own or others. But in some cases where there is a lack of infrastructure for the AAPI community, we are keen as entrepreneurs to help incubate and create those entities. So if you look at infrastructure across the LGBTQ community, across the Black community and other communities, they have national research institutes. They have national policy institutes. They have national media partnership or watchdog organizations. If you look at the AAPI community, we have fragments of that. We have people doing great individual research in their research centers, but no national research consortium or organization, like the Williams Institute at UCLA for the LGBTQ community, or the Clayman Institute at Stanford for the women's movement. And so we don't have a media watchdog group fully formed like GLAAD for the LGBTQ community. We want to support organizations that can play that role, and in some cases help to create and incubate organizations. Besides just funding, we understand that capacity building is critical. So building the skills and capabilities. And fortunately, we have great partners for this. We're working with several of the leading consulting firms. McKinsey has pledged $100 million to an Asian Leadership Institute, which is an established leadership program that they've developed for other communities, including the Black community, and where they have earmarked $100 million in value as part of our initiative to support the development of Asian American leaders as well. So that's a great way to increase representation in the leadership space with existing partners. So that's really the kind of model, and that will bring capabilities to help develop capacity at these organizations as some of those that we incubate as well.
This sounds quite well thought through and quite holistic. You mentioned something about data-driven. Can you shine a little bit more light on where this data comes from? How do we get to that data?
To the credit of our founders, it's critical for us to work with leading data organizations in the US, such as Stop AAPI Hate, AAPI Data, Pew, leading academic centers like UMass, Boston, UCLA, and others, to convene and bring together these thought leaders to develop a national research agenda. These are some of the goals we have. We don't necessarily have to create the data ourselves. We'd work with academic partners and other organizations to generate the data, but we need to understand what are the key data that we're looking for, what is missing, and how can we support the development of that data. For our status index, which is the research we did about American perceptions of Asian Americans, for launch, we actually are forming a mini consortium this year that includes launch, includes TAAF, includes hopefully Stop AAPI Hate, AAPI Data, and a leading group of academic advisors. So we're really starting to form, in effect, a mini consortium of leading AAPI data groups to interrogate and identify data needs and even to generate the data ourselves. We're going to be doing this year is to create a database of these AAPI organizations so that there is a location that people can go to, volunteers, funders, government folks, AAPI organizations themselves who want to collaborate with other organizations. We're going to be building a database which is robust. It will be updated. It will include key metric cells that describe the nonprofit organizations really as a resource for our community. This is long overdue. We have some wonderful corporate partners as well as some other nonprofit organizations like APIP that are keen to work together on this as well. So this is one of our key initiatives for 2022.
I'm starting to get a good sense of what are the big dimensions along which the work will happen. What I'm still struggling with is how can we at AAUC, what value can we provide to TAAF?
First, I'm a big fan of your podcast. I can honestly say I've listened to every single one of them, and I find it to be incredibly informative. We need more partners who are sharing our story and are discussing seriously the issues and opportunities for our community. And AAUC does a fantastic job doing that. We are very inclusive in our philosophy about working with other organizations. So we'd be delighted to talk to you further about how to highlight the work done by leaders in our community to increase awareness, not only within our community, but outside of our community. To me, that is a huge goal. How do we have non-Asian American and Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians understand our history, our background, our challenges, and our hopes for the future? So for us, developing partnerships with key media players is critical. And I look forward to brainstorming AAUC and your partner organizations to really make that happen.
Well, thank you for the offer. We talked about a lot of things, but what's the big message here? What is different about TAAF? What is the new energy and organization that TAAF is bringing to the cause of AAPI community?
So I know at the end of each of your podcasts, you have key points. And so here are our key points for today's conversation. Number one, just to remind that TAAF is a convener, incubator, and funder committed to accelerating opportunity and prosperity, a sense of belonging for the 23 million AAPIs living throughout the US. Number two, we are really investing in building the infrastructure needed to improve AAPI advocacy, power, and representation across American society. And we are eager to work with partners and organizations across industries to bring that mission to life. We are not just a funder. People sometimes think of us, because of the $1.1 billion headline number, as just a source of funding. We want to partner with organizations and really work with them in ways that go way beyond just funding. And thirdly, TAAF strives not only to respond to today's challenges, which are significant, that are facing our communities, but really to fundamentally transform our empowerment, our support, and our future place in American society. Ultimately, it's about the prosperity and belonging that we're going to help build, the pride that we want our community to feel, and the acceptance that we demand in American society. That's really the longer term vision. It's not just about fighting the hate, it's about creating a greater acceptance and understanding of our community.
Wonderful. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Rajeev, for the stimulating discussion.
Thank you, Norman Chen and Rajeev Singh, for providing an insightful interview about a unique experience of being Asian American and the Asian American Foundation's ambitions and goals for the future. TAAF is very fortunate to have such a talented and worldly person as Norman to serve as its executive director. We undoubtedly will be hearing more about the continued successes of TAAF now and in the future. Join us again next month when we focus on the topic of AAPI data and the importance it has in organizing, protecting, and promoting our common communities.
This is Dr. S.K. Low, President of Asian American Unity Coalition. Thank you for listening to our podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast and tune in to our next podcast episode on the last Sunday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The AAUC podcast is supported by active individual lifetime members and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website at asamunitycoalition.org.